In today's lecture, we're going to look at working with time in Google Sheets. Essentially, Google Sheets handles time as a fraction of 1. So 0.75 equals 6 o'clock, 1800 hours equals 0.75, 0.5 equals 12 o'clock, 0.25 equals 6 a.m., and so on. And you can see I've listed out the equivalent decimal fraction of each hour of the 24-hour clock. So we'll look at our first example of recording times. We have a start time and a finish time, and we've calculated the elapsed time. So the start time is calculated is just hour, minute, and second format. Finish time in exactly the same hour, minute, and second format. And the elapsed time is the difference between the higher figure and the earlier figure, and the elapsed time is recorded in hours, minutes, and seconds. Now there is a problem in the way that time is handled in spreadsheets, or in particular Google Sheets. If I take these 21 entries, each of them over an hour, I would expect this to add up to more than 24 hours, but it doesn't. It gives me a very strange result here, and basically I can't work with this. What I want to do is add up all the elapsed time and find out how many hours, minutes have elapsed in total. So what I must do is take each of these individual elements and break them down into seconds format. So how do I do that? Well, I have to take the hour amount and convert it into seconds, take the minute amount, convert it into seconds, and the seconds amount, and add the three components together. So I use three functions: equals hour, open bracket, and then multiply that by 3600, which is 60 by 60, or alternatively I can just go multiply by 60 to convert it to minutes, and then 60 again to convert that to seconds. Wrap that in a bracket, plus then minute, reference cell C2, multiply that by 60 to convert the minutes into seconds, wrap this in a bracket, and then finally plus second. There we have it. So the formula is take the hours from C2, multiply them by 60 by 60, or I can just change that to 3600, same thing. Add the minutes from cell C2, multiply it by those by 60, and add the seconds from cell C2 and add them all together, and that gives me 4535 seconds, and I fill that formula right down at the bottom. I don't need to add them up at this stage. So that's the total seconds. To get the total minutes, just get this figure here, so it equals the seconds, and divide that by 60. So now I have the elapsed time expressed as minutes and decimal seconds. And now I can total them just using the sum function. Cells required. I can now get rid of the decimal points just using equals trunc, open bracket, the value, comma 0 for the decimal places, so 1587, and then finally that divided by 60 will give me the total hours. So in fact, the total elapsed time for all these recorded times is 26 hours, 26.45 hours, so almost 26.5 hours. In this next example is a little more complex. We have a series of overtime start times and clock out times. What we want to do here is calculate the overtime earned up to 8 o'clock, which is calculated at 1.25 times the normal rate, and then calculate the hours worked after 8 o'clock, which is at a higher overtime rate of 1.5 times the normal rate of pay. So what we need to do is calculate the total overtime, and we do this in this cell here, in this column here, and it's a straightforward calculation. It's taking this lower figure, the 6 o'clock time, away from the higher clock out time. So it's simply a question of the higher time minus the earlier time and fill down. Straightforward. Next, we need to calculate the overtime worked up to 8 o'clock. So what we can do is we have to determine whether they worked before 8 o'clock or after 8 o'clock. So we can work out the time that they clocked out if the time they clocked out is before 8 o'clock, or if they clocked out after 8 o'clock, put a ceiling on the time of 8 o'clock. And we do this with this formula here. It's equals min, open bracket, take this clock out time here, C2, comma, time 20, comma, 00, comma, 0, or minus the clock in time, 6 o'clock. So this person worked an hour and 35, an hour and 50 minutes, and the rest worked 2 hours before the cut-off time. Now calculating the overtime on the higher rate is just simply a question of taking this figure away from this figure. So it's equals. So the first two people don't have any overtime at the higher rate. The next person has 5 minutes because the overtime at the lower rate is 2 hours and his total overtime is 2 hours and 5 minutes, so it's only 5 minutes at the higher rate, and so on. The next step is to convert these amounts into decimals so that we can use the decimal to calculate the overtime to be paid. So it's a question of converting the hour element and to minutes. We can ignore the seconds because they're all zeros, and divide it by 60 to convert the overall figure to decimals. So it's equals hour so what this formula here says, take the hour from cell G2 here at the overtime rate, multiply by 60 to convert it to minutes, add the minutes from G2. This part of the calculate formula here will give the total overtime at the lower rate in minutes, and dividing that by 60 will just convert it to a decimal. Down. So the first two people have under 2 hours of overtime, and the others have exactly 2 hours overtime at the lower rate. The second calculation is much the same, except we're looking at column H now for the overtime rate. So it's the hours H2 multiplied by 60 to convert into minutes, add the minutes from H2, divide by 60 to convert that to decimal hours. So 0 for the first two because they don't have any hours worked after 8 o'clock, and these are the decimal hours worked after 8 o'clock. Final step of the calculation, and I'm just going to reveal the hidden column A, which has their standard hourly rate, which is a simple formula taking the standard hourly rate multiplied by the normal overtime rate of 1.25 multiplied by I2, which is the number of decimal hours worked at the lower rate, and then add that to the standard hourly rate multiplied by the higher overtime rate of 1.5 multiplied by J2, which is the hours worked at the higher rate. So the first person gets 24.74 payable in overtime, 28.65 up to this person here who's earned 94.50 in overtime on this particular day. Lastly, just want to point out a pitfall when working with times. If you're calculating elapsed time, so this time less the earlier time, to calculate the elapsed time, that could be fine and you can convert it into decimals, no problem. This top one is absolutely fine. But here we have on line 5 what seem to be exactly the same entries, elapsed time, but yet the decimal conversion is 1.1 as opposed to 0.1. And if I click into it, you'll see that it's actually using date and time. So this is the 27th of February 2014 at 12:34, and this one is the 28th of February at 14:58. So there's an actual whole day has elapsed between these two times, and that's why it's coming out with a decimal of 1.1. So if you are working with dates and times, you will need to elaborate your formula from just taking one cell away from another to be a little more complex. And this one here is using the time function, which has an hour component, a minute component, and a second component, and taking the time function, hour component, minute component, second component. So it's, even though it's ignoring the date element, of this entry here. So it is just something to be wary of, and it is something that might trip you up, that you might have to use a more complex formula such as this, which strips out the time from the date and time entry. Thank you for watching.